This video is a very, very broad overview of Hebrew verb tenses. What is a verb? Well, you might remember from English grammar that a verb is an action verb, an action word. At least that's what most of them are. And by that I mean is that the verb is the part of the sentence that communicates some sort of action. So he ran, he jumped, speak, fall. Those are all action verbs. Of course, there are also linking verbs in English. Is, are, were, will be. Those are being verbs. Most verbs are action verbs, and they can be of different kinds even there. So you have what are called transitive verbs. Transitive verbs are verbs that communicate action to an object. So a transitive verb will take what's sometimes called a direct object. So I hit the ball. Hit is the verb. Ball is the object of hitting. It is the direct object of the verb. There are also, however, in English, intransitive verbs that don't communicate action to an object, but they are actions still. So I run. I don't run the ball, although I suppose there is another sense of the word run where you could say I ran the athletes ragged, but that's a different sense. When I use the word in terms of I run, that's an intransitive verb. I run doesn't take a direct object. So there's a brief reminder of what verbs are in English. There are, just as our starting point, we might say that there are two tenses in Hebrew. What is a tense? The first tense, the two tenses in Hebrew are the perfect tense and the imperfect tense. Now that's, again, the more you get into it, there's a little bit more complexity than that, but let's go ahead and start there. So the perfect tense is one of the tenses in Hebrew. Now the beginner thinks, perfect tense, this must be past time. Because in English, when we talk about tenses, what are tenses? In English, when we talk about tenses, we're talking about the timing of the verb. So did it happen in the past? Is it happening in the present? Will it happen in the future? Those are the main tenses in English: past, present, future tense. We tend to think of tense in terms of time. And so if you have to match Hebrew to English, you're going to say, perfect tense must be the past tense. Problem is, of course, is that languages don't map to each other that neatly necessarily. English has a sense of tense that has to do with time, but Hebrew and Greek don't think of tense primarily as timing. So you might move to the next, maybe an intermediate Hebrew student might say, well, okay, the perfect tense is about something that's completed, and of course most things are completed in the past. You can talk about something in the future as if it was a done deal. Greek does some subtle things like that, for example. You're getting closer when you think of the perfect tense in terms of something that's completed. And by the way, the Hebrew grammarians don't necessarily agree on all these things. Grammar, even after 2,000 years, there's still somewhat of a moving target in terms of where grammarians are at in deciding what they think these things mean. But I think probably the best way to think of the perfect tense is to think of it a little bit like the aorist tense in Greek. To think of the perfect tense in Hebrew as basically being simple action. You're kind of looking at the event as a whole, whether it's finished or not. Those words, if I were a student, wouldn't communicate it to me. I'm going to try to take a couple more swipes at it. I think of this type of tense as basically, well, first of all, tense in both Greek and Hebrew primarily is about the kind of action rather than the timing. So in Greek, there is one tense that has to do with an ongoing activity. The aorist tense in Greek is where you're saying it just happened. I'm not saying whether it kept happening. I'm not saying whether it used to happen. I'm just saying, blah, it happened. And to me, the perfect tense in Hebrew is a little like that. You're not making a lot of nuances in talking about the kind of action. You're just saying it happened. And so most of the time, your starting point should be, when you're looking at a perfect verb in Hebrew, your starting translation should probably be a past tense. But be aware that that's not an absolute, not at all. And you have to flex with the context. If your common sense is taking you in a different direction with the perfect tense, then go with it. Now, of course, it can take some time to develop a good common sense when it comes to languages. But if you think of the perfect tense as being in this ballpark, just kind of it happened. I'm not telling you how it happened. I'm just saying it happened. If you kind of start with that, kind of start with past tense, kind of start with, the idea of a perfect, this nomenclature, the word perfect in this context has a sense of being completed. So if you want to start, basically start with this ballpark understanding of the perfect tense in Hebrew, and then let the context of the passage you're looking at, the verse you're looking at, mold you after its own way. Now, I should say that this video presumes that you can use Hebrew tools to find out whether or not a verb is a past tense. There are all kinds of free tools, such as interlinear.org is one right now. There are all kinds of tools right now to have access to the Hebrew. Actually, unfortunately, interlinear.org does not yet have the full, what we call parsing of the Hebrew. It does for the Greek, but it doesn't have it yet for the Hebrew. I assume it will get it. And so you're still going to have to be reliant to find out whether a Hebrew verb is perfect or imperfect is the other tense. You're going to be relying on some other source. Logos would have that. BibleWorks would have that. I have an Old Testament parsing guide, a big thick book that parses all the verbs. Parse is to give the analysis of. And so I'm assuming that you're going to be able to find out whether a Hebrew verb is perfect by some cheat. And again, it's not immoral to use Hebrew cheats. But I assume you're going to be able to find out from some other source whether or not it's a perfect tense. And if you know it's a perfect tense, then this gives you at least a beginner's sense of how to figure out how to translate it. Let me give you an example. The verb katal, and the first A is a long one, by the way, if you're a perfectionist. The verb to kill, katal means he killed, is often the model verb in Hebrew, not because it's a great concept, we're into killing, yeah, that's not the idea, but because it's normal. It's what we call in Hebrew a strong verb. There are lots of weak verbs in Hebrew, and what happens with the weak verbs is one of the letters runs away, and you have to figure out what happened. It's like someone blew up a bomb, and you're left with certain pieces, and you have to figure out what was there originally. Hebrew verbs are generally triliteral, that is, they're based upon three basic consonants. So in this case, it's kof, tate, and lamed. That's a tate, not a tav here. So a weak verb, either the first or the second or the third consonant goes away and hides. So sometimes the first consonant can go away, sometimes the second consonant can go away, and sometimes the third consonant can go away. We call those weak verbs. What's nice about katal is those three consonants are always going to be there. The kof, the tate, the lamed are always going to be there. And so that's why it's the paradigm verb, because it's normal. So katal would be the perfect, normal, perfect form of this. Katal, he killed. And go ahead and start with the past tense translation. Now you can put a vav on the front, the katal, or wqtl if you're using the other pronunciation. It's still perfect, but that vav on the front connects this to previous tenses. And so the Hebrew grammarians used to call this a vav consecutive or a vav conversive. They used to think that when you have an imperfect leadoff hitter earlier on in the sentence, and then you have this, that the vav flips it from past to future. And there are a number of instances in the Hebrew Bible where the wqtl form is about something that happens in the future. And so even though grammarians have definitely backed off of that understanding of a vav on the front of a perfect, there are many instances in the Hebrew Old Testament where it seems to work. And so you often have a sequence of verbs that you have to pay attention to in Hebrew. And one of those sequences is a leadoff hitter that's in the imperfect tense, that's the other tense, and then a vav with the perfect that flips it, if you want to think of it that way, from the past to the future. At least that will work sometimes. Unfortunately for us, people learning Hebrew as a foreign language, you have to kind of, it's an intuitive language. You have to get the feel for it. It doesn't have nice, neat rules a lot of the time. Unfortunately, it's an impressionistic kind of language. Well, what are some of the meanings of the perfect? Well, here we go. If you want to just skip this PowerPoint and go with what I've said so far, feel free. But there can be some nuances, and again, it's very much like the nuances of the aorist tense in Greek are very similar to the nuances of the perfect tense in Hebrew. So constantive is the blah. It's just the default. It happened. I'm not saying how it happened. I'm just saying blah. It happened. He killed. That's it. But there can be other nuances. So there can be a kind of an instantaneous nuance to the perfect. If you want to say something, he died, you're going to use the perfect because it's looking at it as a blah, simple, instantaneous event. You can also focus on the beginning of something. So the perfect, in some contexts, you're going to feel the force. You're going to feel, I feel a began here. He began, to teach. You can feel it in the context. Same way, they can sometimes focus on the end. He finished. That verb finished in and of itself has the sense of coming to an end. And then, of course, perfective in the more grammatical sense is the idea of something that was finished, completed, but the results continued. This is like the Greek perfect tense. So those are some meanings of the simple perfect tense, some nuances that the perfects can have. There are some additional meanings that it can have when it has the vav on the front. This is still the perfect, but it's the perfect with a vav on the front. Two in particular are mentioned in Lee Field's Hebrew for the Rest of Us. Iterative is something that happened from time to time. So he used to read a verse of Hebrew every morning. Used to read is something that Fields considers to be a potential meaning of the perfect when it has a vav on the front. And then continuous is another possible meaning, where you're talking about something he was running for 5 minutes, before he keeled over. So there's a continuous meaning that the perfect with a vav on the front can have. So there you have a brief overview of the perfect. I've already talked about the vav when it's in a sequence of verb, what used to be called the vav consecutive, or used to be called a vav conversive, or even a vav conjunctive. That's when the wqtl is in a series of verbs, and there it's going to tend to take the flavor of whatever verbs have come before it. Okay, now the second tense. So the perfect tense has to do with, I mean, it leans more toward the past. It leans more toward completed action. It tends to have a kind of a simple blah, it happened sense. The imperfect tense tends to be more the tense of the future. And the verbs are a little different. You'll notice that this one tends to have letters on the front. I didn't mention it, but the perfect tense tends to have letters on the end. The imperfect tense tends to add letters on the front. So wqtl means he will kill, with that yod on the front. And the imperfect tense tends to be more incomplete action in that sense. Now there is something called, so again, your starter, beginner, I'm beginning to learn Hebrew, where do I start? You can read the advanced grammars and get corrected later, but just start off with thinking the perfect is a little bit more past, imperfect is a little bit more future, the perfect is a little bit more completed, the imperfect is a little bit more incomplete, and that'll at least get you going. Now, there is something called a converted imperfect. It has a completely different history. It looks, see that wqtl? It looks just like the normal imperfect, but it has a vav, a patak, and it doubles the first letter. Now here we hit pay dirt. I think we do, at least for the moment. The previous perfect and imperfect are kind of nebulous and vague, but the history of this form is a solid past tense. This is a past tense, definitely. And he killed is what this means. You see these all over the narratives of the Old Testament. You see it all over Genesis 1. Vayomer Elohim, and said God, or Vayar Elohim, and saw God. So you see this vav patak doubled next letter all over the stories of the Old Testament. And why? Because it's telling about something that happened. And he killed. And so this one is something you can bank on. This is definitely a past tense form. It actually has a completely different history than the other imperfect, even though it kind of looks the same. And some they used to say, and of course again, everything seems to be in flux with regard to what they actually think, the grammarians. But they used to think of the perfect with a vav on it as being a kind of a mimic of this, that the flipped perfect vakatal, that converted perfect was trying to imitate the converted imperfect. So the idea is that if the vav on the front flips a future to the past, then a vav on the front of the perfect flips a past to the future. Again, that's not always the case, but at least with the converted imperfect, it is definitely a past tense situation. It is truly a preterite or past, simple past tense. Okay, the participle. Now, Hebrew has a perfect tense, it has an imperfect tense, it has a converted imperfect tense. It doesn't have a present tense. So how do you say that something is happening now? Well, one way to do it is to use the participle, kotel, long O, long E, kotel, killing. But Hebrew can use this to say he is killing. The word for is won't be there. It'll just say he killing. But because Hebrew will often omit the to be verb, you have to kind of feel it. But if you can use this killing as a way of saying is killing or are killing, he killing would be a way in Hebrew, to say he is killing. So the participle kotel can be used like a present tense, especially if you're talking about something that is actually going on right now. So I slipped in a present tense even though Hebrew doesn't have a present tense. This is a page from the Hebrew parsing guide I was talking about earlier. And I believe it's by someone named Bell. And I should have brought that with me so that I could tell you for sure. But you'll notice here that we have the verse. This is Genesis. We have the verse on the far left. Then there is the form, and unfortunately this is just the verbs. It doesn't actually even parse the nouns or the adjectives or the other things, which is kind of depressing when you think of how thick this book is, and we're just looking at the verb or verbal forms. So like there's bara from Genesis 1:1, there's hayata and merakefet from Genesis 1:2. So those are the forms that are in the verse in that second column. The third column is something we'll talk about in the next video, so let's forget that for now. But the fourth column, that's the tense, and of course they left the E out so that they could fit everything in. But there's a perfect tense, participle. VCI means vav converted imperfect. That's that converted imperfect that we were talking about. Don't worry about JUS at this point. That means jussive, but that's not in this video, and it's not in the next video. It's a video yet to come in the future. Another vav converted imperfect, vav converted imperfect, vav converted imperfect, vav converted imperfect, perfect, vav converted imperfect, down, 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 down. And there we've seen all of the categories in this column. I'm going to talk about PGN, person, gender, number, in a second. I'll come back to that. The root is the kind of the dictionary form. If you wanted to look up this verb in the dictionary, what would you look it under? Well, there's what you would look it up under. And you can see that because Hebrew adds things like mem or vav or yod, because here's amar, to say, but vayomer, where did the vav and the yod come from? Hebrew adds stuff to the front. And so the genius of this root column is it tells you what the actual first letter of this word is, so that you can look it up. Notice here in 1:7, notice how the hey in asa, the hey has gone away. Why? Because asa is a weak verb. It's a third consonant weak verb, which means that the third consonant, the hey, tends to run away, and that's very annoying. Suffix, sometimes these can have suffixes on them. None of these do. That's in a later video. BDB and KB are dictionaries that I'll talk about in the next slide, but the meaning at the end tells you the basic meaning of that root verb, so that you can have some sense of translating it. I'll come back to this in a second. If I don't mess up like I am. Okay, tense abbreviations for this particular video. The PFT is the perfect tense. The WCP, we didn't see any of those in the page that I showed you, is the vav consecutive perfect. That's where the perfect tense has a vav on it and is flipped. IMPF, imperfect. VCI, vav consecutive imperfect. That's the vav converted imperfect. And PTC, participle. I already told you all that. Now let's talk about what BDB and KB are. BDB stands for Brown, Driver, and Briggs. This is the classic Greek dictionary, or lexicon as it's called. And so that number there tells you how you can find, and you can use that number without actually knowing the Hebrew. That's the nice thing about the number. And because everything's gone electronic, you can probably get the paper version of this for a song used on Amazon. KB, Kohler, Baumgartner, another kind of more modern lexicon. Again, with so many lexicons being free online, the usefulness of buying one is increasingly diminishing. And of course, meaning means the translation of the verb in its context. Okay, PGN, I said I'd mention. What is PGN? Person is either first, second, or third person. You may know this. Languages other than English sometimes distinguish the subject by changing the letters on the verb. First person is I in the singular. It's we in the plural. It's from the standpoint of the ones doing the speaking. You is who we're speaking to, and it can be either singular or plural. And then if we're talking about someone or something, that's the third person, he, she, it, or in the plural, they. That's what person is. And you don't have to know how, but Hebrew verbs do tell you what kind of subject they have. Hebrew verbs specify the the kind of subject by putting an ending on it that's either first or second or third, or putting something on the front. I'll talk about that in a second. Gender means masculine or feminine. Hebrew does have two genders. And then lastly, number is singular or plural. So the column PGN in the Hebrew Parsing Guide is going to tell you whether the subject is first person, second person, third person, masculine or feminine, or singular or plural in that PGN column. Finally, let me mention what I'm talking about. The perfect tense tends to put letters on the end of the verb. The imperfect tense tends to put letters on the front of the verb. And so in the perfect tense, you're going to distinguish the person, the gender, the number, and all that by various letters on the end. And the imperfect tense is going to change the letters on the front to tell you the person, the gender, and the number. That's, again, something that English doesn't really do, part of the strange new world of learning the Hebrew language. So this has been a very, very broad and brief overview of Hebrew tenses.